Hey everyone, Andre here. I've been asked as of late to do a lot of different videos with regards to aviation photography workflow. Typically, I would run everything through Lightroom, Photoshop, and with the help of some filters, complete my workflow. But I've been asked to do a video using Lightroom only. That being said, Lightroom to me is more of a cataloging piece of software with basic opportunities to edit. It is not a full comprehensive packet that lets you tune in a photo to every extent, working with layers and so forth. But it is definitely possible to edit photos and make them upload worthy to sites like airplanepictures.net. And I'm going to use a photo that was sent to me by Darren Kearns. He's a fellow spotter on airplanepictures.net. It's a good photo to use because it's not of highest quality. It's pretty soft out of the camera, so I'm going to kind of show how I would look at a picture like that and try to get it upload worthy. And I'm going to start in Lightroom and wrap it up in Lightroom as well. So the first thing I always do, I do have an external hard drive that all of my raw files and finished documents live on. Strongly recommend that and just kind of keeping your work clean. And of course, raw files take a lot of space, but I have all of my raw files imported in a folder structure to my external hard drive. So when I go in and pick pictures to work with, they're all cataloged into different folders in Lightroom under the airports that I go. So I'm going to get into showing kind of how I import and how I organize them, but just wanted to show that first and foremost. I have downloaded the file that Darren sent me. Usually I would take the SD card out of my camera and plug it into the computer and then import directly from that SD card into the Lightroom catalogs. I will not copy the files from the SD card to my hard drive. It's just an extra step that I don't want to have to deal with. And that's one of the strengths that Lightroom has, is to be able to import into a folder structure on your hard drive. So I have the raw file there. I'm going to pretend that one is going to come from an SD card, and we're going to import it in Lightroom. So the first thing I'm going to do, obviously, is open Lightroom. And we're going to go and import that photo into Lightroom. So you can see right now the catalog that's open on my screen is the Aviation 2015 calendar under the raw files directory on my hard drive. So if you right click it, you can go through previous folders that you've used as a recent. So if I want to go in and look at raw files from Seattle Tacoma International Airport, I can do so right there too. And there's a different way too, where you can go through and check everything that you have in terms of files on there. If you go from the develop module into library, you now have the opportunity to cycle through everything that you have on your hard drive in terms of raw files. So here's my entire raw file catalog sorted on my external hard drive. So it'll go through everything that you have, and it's just a very clean way to have your work organized. So the first thing I'm going to do is just kind of quickly go through the Lightroom settings. It's not really something that you have to worry too much about in terms of this edit, because we're going to do everything in Lightroom. But if you were to export this to a different editing software, you'll see that there's an external editing tab, and I'm just kind of showing really quick how mine is set up in order to send it into Photoshop. So I'm not going to go through these different settings because it's not really the intent of this video, but it kind of shows you what my settings look like. So if you're pausing the video, you can kind of take a peek of that. And this is how I got my Lightroom set up in terms of sending the file into Photoshop. And then the same thing with file handling. I use the internal camera raw treatment that actually lives within Lightroom. Obviously, you can run Camera Raw as a separate individual raw file adjuster as well, and then send them from there into Photoshop too. But Camera Raw gives you even more limited options to work with than Lightroom. So I don't really do anything about these. So we're going to cancel out of that, and we're going to import the picture that Darren sent me. So first step to that is go into the library module, and then click on the import function. It's going to bring up kind of the desktop that we're going to have in front of us in terms of this is your source area, so this is where you're pulling your file from. So if you wanted to pull it from my external hard drive or internal hard drive, if you had other sources, you can go up on the top and choose so. So this is where I typically would see my SD card, and I would go in and import from there, but we know in this case I saved it to my desktop. So clicking on desktop, it's going to bring up the options that you have in terms of import. And here's the raw file that Darren sent me. So we're going to untick the video that I have on my desktop as well. And then we're going to send it into the destination folder. So this is also one of those things where you have an opportunity to kind of set you up for a future workflow as well. So as far as destination, I have subfolders. So it's going to be dropped into the other folder, which basically is files that I'm working on for others. I have everything sorted in airport codes, so it's a lot easier for me to go in and figure out where do I have certain raw files. So in this case, it's going to go into other because it is not my file, and it's not a file that was shot at any of the airports that I typically frequent. And then once it drops it into that structure folder, I also drop it, I check the box that says into subfolder, and basically the subfolder just brings it up by date. So you'll see the year, and then you'll sort them also by dates. So that's how I'd set it up. It's a lot easier to work through instead of dumping everything into a folder and have no structure below that. It's harder to find the files then, because if you're shooting or looking for something you shot a month ago, you can immediately go in and figure out where is it at. So it'll be shot at 2015 January 26th. So anything in those terms will be dropped into those folders. So in this case, we're going to drop it into the other folder, and then it'll go into the structure. So Darren took this photo April 11th, 2015. So that's the structure it will be dropped into. The other setting that I also use on this destination side is the don't import suspected duplicates. So if that file is already sitting in on your computer, imported, Lightroom's going to recognize that. In this case, I've been working on and off with this file for a while, so it's already going to recognize it in Lightroom. If I check that box, and you're going to see it's going to be grayed out over here. So I'm going to untick it for now, but I usually have this one checked. So now we have the photo selected from desktop into our other folder, and we're going to just click import on it. And that'll bring up this photo directly into Photoshop in a way that it has been now added to the catalog of others. So if you were to go in under the other folder here, you'll see everything that I have in that folder now lives under the other tab, and then that would be the same thing for this Aer Lingus. All right, so far so good. So obviously to start working on a photo, we're going to be doing all of that work in the develop module. So here is the raw file. If you click I on your keyboard, you will get all of the information up on the EXIF data on that file. So it's 5,184 by 3,456. And if you click I one more time, you'll see he shot it at a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second, f/22, ISO 100, 229 focal length, and he shot this with a Sigma 150 to 500 millimeter. So that gives us all kind of basics. So there are some things that I would have done maybe slightly different, and I'll go in and explain kind of why that would be. So one, I try to shoot at a faster shutter speed than 1/60th. If you're shooting at this shutter speed, you certainly run into the risk of something being blurry just because the shutter is open for a longer period of time. So in this case, I probably would have set your f-stop, your aperture. Right now it's closed down a lot, so it captures a lot of depth of field, but the fact that you're shooting at such a high f-stop is forcing your shutter speed down. So if you shot this one, let's say at f8, you would probably have an automatic calculation done if you're shooting in shutter or in aperture priority. A shutter speed would probably be corrected more so to like 1/600 or 1/800 of a second, giving you a much greater chance to be able to freeze the image sitting in your viewfinder. So that is one thing that I would do. So static airplanes, I typically shoot in aperture priority. And then moving aircraft, I will shoot in shutter speed. And shutter speed, I would typically shoot, I try to aim for twice the amount of focal length. So if you're shooting at 230 millimeters, I would be shooting for somewhere around 1/500 of a second in terms of shutter speed. So just kind of some quick insight on that. The next piece on a photo like this is you always want to look at them in 100% view, or in Lightroom we call it 1:1. So now we are looking at the shot in a 1:1, and this is where we're going to start seeing a lot of flaws in the photo. And this, to me, is probably more so due to the low shutter speed than anything else. So the first thing we're going to do in the actual edit process is to apply the proper lens profile. Every lens is gonna, be slightly different in terms of how it looks at the photo. Typically, they would come out of the camera in a raw file with a lens vignetting up in upper and lower corners. So what we're gonna do first to start off is go down under lens corrections. We're going to choose enable profile corrections. It automatically will recognize the lens. If it doesn't, you may have to choose the model for your lens from the drop down, but typically it would always recognize that as soon as you tick this box. And then under basic, I check all three boxes here. Chromatic aberration basically is the purple fringing you'll see around edges of the plane. And then, of course, also having your profile corrections enabled, and then the constraint crop enabled. So now we've done the basic, work in terms of bringing the photo in and doing and applying the proper lens profile to get any kind of twerks out of the photo that may be a result of the glass that you're using. So back to the 100% view, you certainly can see that the image is soft throughout. So I know immediately that this is not going to be a shot that I edit to, let's say, 1600 pixels or even 1400 pixels. I think you're probably going to be more looking at 1024 or 1100, or the most standard one, which is 1200 pixels across. So before we do any serious edits to this photo, we want to make sure that we're working on it in the output resolution that we're going to be using. So I'm going to edit this one to 1200 pixels, but I want to make some small corrections before that, just to make sure that we get the proper white balance and some initial components done, including crop. So the first thing I always do with a photo is to crop it. And obviously you can choose different aspect ratios. Airplanepictures.net is pretty cool in the fact that they also allow you to crop 16:9. I think you're the only website out there that allows such a wide angle crop. Most other websites just usually gives you the option of 4:3 or 3:2 In this case, I'm going to use the original crop ratio, just because it doesn't have a lot of, if there was foreground clutter or something to that extent, I would probably use a 16:9, but in this case there really isn't anything, and whatever was in the bottom here disappeared as I moved the crop tighter. So we have the same distance from the nose to the edge as we do from the horizontal stabilizer. So we've already now adjusted the crop, and what I'm going to do is look for horizontal leveling of the photo. In this case, it looks pretty good to begin with. In a shot like this, I would use permanent structure as measurements. Do not use lampposts because they're never going to be exactly dead even. So what I do is I click on the angle slider tab there, and I leave the mouse right there, and then I use the left and right arrows to make small adjustments. You can do it with the mouse too, but the mouse usually isn't as precise as the arrows are, so it gives you a little bit more controlled movement. So I'm kind of playing around with this, and what I want to use for this shot is probably the vertical frames within the windows in a terminal. So if you're using the one right up above the nose, you can see where the photo needs to land in terms of being horizontally sound. And you know, he held the camera pretty steady on this one, and it was pretty straight, so there really isn't a lot of correction needed, and so forth. It looks like just a 0.01 degree to the right here is what I ended up with. So once that is done, click done. And now we have a cropped photo that has been perfectly leveled as well. Not going to do a lot of basic adjustments in here, but I'm going to do a few. And this is how I would do it every single time going into just a Lightroom edit. First thing to do is set the white balance, and obviously I recommend shooting raw because it gives you every bit of an opportunity that your camera has before you shoot. JPEG actually processes the photo before it gets out of your camera, and it gives you very limited options in post-processing. So always shoot raw. That is my opinion, and I stick with that one. So in this case here, the white balance looks pretty good on this one. It doesn't look blue, it doesn't look red. You can obviously verify that with a histogram as well, but I usually just kind of cycle through the option and see how the photo appears to me. So daylight made it very, very green. Cloudy is going to make it very orangey green. So auto or as shot in this case looks the best. Auto gives you a little bit of a red tint that I didn't like, so I'm going to go to as shot. Which brings a little bit of green into it, but I'm going to go to as shot. I'm going to move the slider one step to the right, just to kind of get a little bit more warmth in it, to get kind of that afternoon sun, which looks to be the case here. So after white balance is set, I'm going to go and adjust exposure on the shot. From the histogram, you can see that the shot is a little bit underexposed. And what I mean with that is that the mid curve here falls closer to the blacks than it does the whites. So we're going to boost exposure so we can kind of get the curve right to the middle of the frame here. So plus 0.4 in this case seems to be pretty good. The next thing we're going to do is adjust whites and blacks. And the way I do it is I hold in the Alt key, and then I click and hold the mouse button, and then you can slide left and right. So basically what you want to do here with the whites is you want to slide it to the right until you're starting to see some bleed through and some light from spots on the fuselage. You can see when I'm on 0, you can see some small spots from the light, but that's usually because of landing gear or taxiing lights or landing lights. So that I'm not as concerned about as I am, for instance, the nose in this case. When you're starting to see the colors from the nose come out, this would really cause the whites to be blown out on the nose, and that's not what you want. So you want to back it off until that portion of light disappears, and right now we're down to just a dot, and we find ourselves around a plus. I'm going to leave it at plus 12 here. Let go of the mouse button and let go of the Alt key, and now you've set the proper whites on the shot. And then you want to do the same thing for the blacks. Hold the Alt key on your keyboard, click and hold the mouse button, and then slide the slider to the left until you're starting to see some of the shadows come in. If you go all the way over, you can see any area on the photo that is all black here would be clipped. So basically you've erased all of the details from those areas. So what you want to do here again is only go as far to the left as you're starting to see some bleed through from colors or shadows. And right now we're starting to get a little bit of a pixelation there from the gear, and we're going to leave it at about, yeah, it looks like -19 is a pretty good spot here. So release the mouse button and release the Alt button, and you now also have perfectly balanced whites and blacks. So that's really kind of the basic concept to it. I don't do any sharpening at this size. If you were to sharpen it now and then resize it, you will get jagged edges and artifacts very, very fast. So we're not going to do any sharpening now. We're going to get to that a little bit later. But what we are going to do is we're going to go back into 100% view or 1-to-1 view, and we're going to look at the photo. And you can see noise in the shadow areas here of the fuselage. So we're going to go under the Detail tab. We're going to turn off the sharpening, so we're not going to do it in this resolution, but we are going to add some luminous noise reduction. And this is kind of trial and error. You know, it's really coming down to, again, look at it in 1-to-1, because that is the view that you want to have as you're doing any kind of editing. So in this case, looks like 40 is a good point of edit or noise reduction. It's taken away all of the grain in the bottom part of the fuselage. And then I also bumped the color noise reduction all the way over to 100. So color noise are small color specks that you find within the regular noise. It's not gonna have an effect on the photo to the point where it starts blurring it, like the luminance reduction. If I slide it too far to the right, it'll start blurring out and taking away details from the plane. So that is the basic adjustment that we are going to make for now in Lightroom. If you click on the Y button on the keyboard, you'll see the before and you'll see the after. And sharpness is no better, but it is a balanced photo that has a good exposure and a good whites and black tones. So I'll click Y again. And what we're going to do now is export it into JPEG format, and then we're going to bring it back in the size that we're going to be editing the photo. So right click on your mouse, and then instead of going, what I would do with this shot when I would use Photoshop is go into the edit in and then send it to Photoshop. In this case, we're going to go down to the export tab, and we're going to go up to the export option at the top. And here's where some of the magic happens, and this is easy to go wrong for most people. So I export to hard drive. Obviously you'll have different options up at the top, and I export to a specific folder. So in this case the folder is my desktop. And otherwise, if you were to be using Lightroom only, you'd probably set yourself up with a folder that you would drop these into. But remember, this is just a temporary export. This is not going to be the final file. And then file name, I don't change any of that stuff. I typically use the file name that is given to it in camera, and then when I'm all done and finalizing the photo, I'll go in and rename it. I typically use the airline and the airplane type in my naming, so it's easier to find the files. So what we're going to do is go all the way down to the file settings. And you want to save this in JPEG format. The color space you want to use is the sRGB, and this is where people go wrong. sRGB is really the standard for websites to show. If you were to use another color space on this one, you'd get some weird color casts as you're loading your photo. Make sure that the quality is set to 100. We want to make sure that we're getting the best output quality for the shot. it will be resized to fit the long edge, and this is where we're going to resize it to 1200 pixels across. If you had a better file with a sharp photo to start with, you'd be using maybe 1600, but I always recommend for people to upload to an aviation site and no bigger than 1200 unless you have a fantastic and really sharp photo to start with. Smaller resolutions it will make it easier to hide any kind of imperfections that you have. I always keep it at resolution 300 pixels per inch, good for print. And then scrolling further down, I don't have any output sharpening on. Obviously, you can decide whether you want your metadata to be included. So this is the EXIF settings that will show up under your photo on the website. I usually show all my EXIF data. I don't have any issues with that. So watermarking, all that stuff. So after export, do nothing. So what I do now is just click export. And that setting that you just chose will remain the same. So you don't have to go through much of an adjustment in order to export your next one. So now we've exported the photo. We want to go back into library, and we want to go into import. It's going to bring up the import box again, and we know we saved it to the desktop, and you can see the JPEG is sitting here on the desktop, so we want to move that back in. I'll drop it one more time in the other folder, and now you'll be seeing the photo in the view that we are going to be editing to. So you can see here we have the JPEG back in. You can see that from the name at the bottom. Go back into the develop module, and now you can see when we click on the 1:1 up here in the ratio, now we're looking at the photo in the exact view that we are going to be editing to. And this is important because if you were to zoom in and work on your edit from that point, you're now working on a very skewed look at what the photo would end up kind of appearing like in the end. So you want to edit either in 100% mode or 1:1 as it's called here in Lightroom. So we're not going to go back in and do any kind of noise adjustments here, and we are not going to use the sharpening slider over on this side on the shot here. This just basically applies a uniform level of sharpening across the whole photo. And the problem with that is that some areas you can add a lot of sharpening and it's going to look good, but now you're getting jagged edges on cockpit windows, you're getting jagged edges on the door frames, so you're getting artifacts already just because you're applying a very standard sharpening across the whole shot. So we're going to turn off sharpening there, and what we're going to do instead is brush sharpening on the photos, so it gives us a lot more of an opportunity to fine-tune the areas that we're going to affect by sharpening. So you're going to go into your brush tool, your adjustment brush, click on it. And I played with this photo before. I found 45 in sharpness level to work really good. I keep my brush size just kind of as needed as I go over. I just pulled the feather all the way to the left because you don't need a feathered brush to apply this type of an effect. So I kept it all the way to the left, and it basically means that anything that falls within the circle will be affected by the same amount of sharpening and effect from where you go. I have flow at 100, I have density at 55, and I uncheck the auto mask. Auto mask basically is an intelligent way for the software to figure out how to pinpoint the sharpening even more detailed. Right now I'm not going to mess with trying to mask out certain areas. I'm just going to really focus on those areas that I want to have sharpened in the first place. So in this case, we're going to start now by applying some very selective sharpening to the shot, and I'm going to start brushing the tail, and you can kind of see what it does in the end. You can turn it off and on by clicking this little checkbox here in the bottom, and you can see there's on, there's off. You can definitely see a nice level of sharpening already added to that point. And I'm also gonna just paint in this PT mark up in the corner. So now we've kind of brushed in some sharpening to these pieces, and it's looking better. Doesn't mean that we're done yet, but we are gonna kind of move on to some other areas. So what I'm gonna do now is go over some other areas that I also think need some work. The air lingus is very, very soft. So we're gonna go over and brush some sharpening on that area as well. And be careful, you don't wanna be so aggressive with the sharpness slider that you're starting to see wide edge halos around the lettering, or obviously jagged edges. We're going to do the same thing here with the cabin windows. We're going to be a little bit more careful with the cabin doors and the emergency exits, because any straight line on these photos tend to get jagged edges very, very quickly. What I am going to sharpen would be the inside, so the handle, the little light, or the little glass inside the door. I want to sharpen the Airbus A319. And you can see just by sliding over there one time, now you can actually read the writing. We're going to do the same thing with the details inside your rear cabin door. We're going to brush the tail just in general. Again, be careful with the horizontal line here. It tends to get jagged very quickly. We're going to go over the wing. We're going to just kind of brush onto the landing gear, the engine. You do not have to be super precise on this. If you miss the fuselage, it's not going to really have much of a negative effect, because you're only brushing on sharpening. You're not brushing on any kind of color or changes to it. So we've kind of gone over. I want to be careful with cockpit windows too. Straight lines, like I said, have a tendency to get jagged very, very quickly. So you could always try it, and if you're seeing jagged edges popping up, you can always hit Control Z or Command Z on a Mac, and that will undo the last stroke that you put on. But in this case, it didn't really create any jagged edges on it, and I could pretty freely go over the entire cockpit area. Also get the cheat line from front to back here. Again, if you're seeing jagged edges there, and this is a pretty common area to get jagged edges, go ahead and undo that, or be careful with the amount of sharpening you're placing on. We're going to brush in some of the other detail areas too, just to get them to pop out a little bit more. So this looks okay, just kind of on initial factor. I am going to probably apply a little bit more selective sharpening in some areas. Like I said, just kind of go over the areas and take a peek at it, and be very, very careful with edges and external outlines. So I'm going to apply a little bit more sharpening to the clover on the tail. I'm probably also going to add a little bit here on the engine detail. Be careful with the nose gear landing door. The registration there tends to get edge halos very, very quickly, or jagged edges. So what we're going to do is we're going to go up here under the brush tool again and click on New. And basically what that does is it adds a new brush that if you were to click over on the old brush, you'd be spending time adjusting. And you can see now by hovering, you'll see all the areas that I applied sharpening to through that brush function. You can see that I haven't painted any of the green areas really on the fuselage, because there's no reason to sharpen areas that don't have any defined edges. All you're going to do in that case is paint on noise. So what we want to do now is click where we're going to start to paint with the other brush, and just kind of get the outline of things, just to make sure that we are kind of achieving that maximum of sharpness that we want. Remember, over sharpening is very, very easy to do, and it's probably one of the more common rejections you're going to see on an aviation photography website. The windows can definitely handle another pass front to back, and now when you're looking at the shot compared to what it was, it actually looks pretty sharp, and I wouldn't really have any issues approving this upload when I go through and do screening. You can even read the St. Rowan, you can read the Airbus A319. So again, just really sit back and critique your work. Obviously very, very important. Sometimes we get very passionate people who are uploading and their shots are rejected and they take it out on screeners just because they didn't pay enough attention to look for the small details. I was just like that in the beginning as well. I tended to think that I was perfect from the get-go, but this is just one of those arts that you keep learning, and you keep learning. It's never really going to end. And that's kind of part of the fun with aviation photography is that whole concept. So if you were to click on obviously we want to click done when we're done with the sharpening piece. If you were to click Y now, it would show you the Airbus before sharpening and after sharpening, and you can definitely see the difference, especially when you're looking at details on the tail and on the Aer Lingus. Engine details are sharper, and you can see the cabin windows don't really have much definition in this case, but over here you can certainly see definition. And we didn't sharpen any of the frames around the cabin and emergency exits because, like I said, they do tend to get jagged very, very quickly, and that could ruin your entire upload immediately. Click Y again, and now we're looking at the photo. Actually, I've been editing in fit mode instead of 1:1 mode. The entire concept is still the same. It wasn't too much of a difference, but I should have been editing in 1:1 mode. And now I can see that there's probably some areas that can take a little bit more sharpening, like the Aer Lingus. That's probably the only area right now that I would sharpen a little bit more. So let's go up on the brush tool, click new, and then let's kind of brush on one more layer over Aer Lingus, and that certainly looks better. So I'm not going to do anything else and sharpen a little bit inside that engine intake to get some of the rivets to kind of pop there a little bit more. So now we're looking pretty good. Click done, and I'm going to consider myself done with this photo. You know, one kind of final look through the curve here. It is kind of peeking towards the middle, which is what we want to see. If you start bringing the whites or the highlights too far up, you'll start to see Lightroom, the histogram up in the top here, starting to warn you that you're entering dangerous territory. And you can see now, you can show, if you're clicking on the arrow here, you can turn the opportunity of seeing the clippings on or off. So now when I'm hovering over that arrow, you can see the plane got this red area on the nose that kind of shows you that you're now kind of blowing out that area by overexposing that white area on the nose. So, and you can see that by the very edge of the histogram here, where the white or the curve is starting to climb up the frame on the right hand side. So we want to back that off and keep it balanced. So this shot is pretty well balanced. It's the same situation on the blacks. If you're basically lowering the blacks, you'll see the curve starting to slide over on the left hand side, and you're taking out details in the shadow areas. So the photo looked good. Just want to make sure that you verify that before you finalize your upload. I didn't add any clarity to this one. Clarity is kind of a very simple way to add some sharpness appearance to the shot. It's not too problematic in a shot like this because you have a lot of contrasty areas behind you. If this was like a blue sky shot, any area that you're applying too much clarity to would start forming edge halos all the way around your aircraft. Clarity and sharpening really is just a way for the software to push the boundary between the white and the black apart, so it appears that the edge is sharper. But the more you add there, the more artifacts that could add to your shot as well. I may slide it over and do +10 in clarity just to get a little bit of extra pop in the shot. But I'm going to consider this one done at this point. I kind of take a quick peek through to make sure that everything looks right. Crop looks good. The verticals look good on the shot. Definitely a lot more sharpness around here. Cockpit windows are sharp. The clover on the back is sharp. Engines look good. So just kind of taking a very, very close look at it before you consider yourself done. And if you find any areas that needs help, just make sure you address it. One final tip that I'm going to go through and show, let's say that you had over sharpened areas at the cockpit window. Again, if you go into the adjustment brush and reduce the sharpness down to, let's say, -40, you now can brush on the opposite effect of the sharpening. You can brush on a slight blur to take away any kind of jagged edges that you may have in this case. And again, I'm using zero feather, flow at 100%, and density at 55%. So now you brushed on a little bit of a blur in those areas, and that allows you to take away any jagged edges that may have popped up there. It didn't look too bad on this one, but there were a few small edges that I just kind of thought may be marginal in terms of an aviation site upload. So I just kind of brushed out those. Don't go too far down with the sharpness slider. That's when you're going to start doing some destructive work on it. But I found that -40 is a really good a measurement of what you can use here in terms of effect. So we're going to click done. We're going to go back in and right click on the mouse. We're going to go down to export and export. Settings remain the same as last time. You know, we're dropping it into the desktop or whatever folder you want to choose. So you can obviously adjust all of that. We're not going to do anything different with this one. It's still going to be resized to that 1200. So basically right now it's overriding the file that we saved previously. And then click on export. And if you close down Lightroom at this point, I have that file on my desktop. If you right click it and click on preview, you now have 100% view of that shot the way that you wrapped up the edit in Lightroom. So at this point, if you're kind of looking at what the file looks like, it's hard to see obviously on the screen through a YouTube video, but you will see some pretty significant differences compared to that original raw file. So I hope this has helped at least a little bit for those who are just using Lightroom to edit. It is definitely possible. It is a little tricky because the tools that you're equipped with are nowhere close to the arsenal that you would have working with Photoshop. But like I said, definitely possible and more than possible to get qualified uploads on Airplane Pictures. So hopefully that helps, and I have a few other videos that I'm working on too, in a whole collection of different processes that I use, including HDR, but hopefully this was helpful for all of you guys, and I will see you guys on the upload websites. Take care.